"You're mistaken," the billionaire shouted. But 5 years later, when he saw her with triplets, he collapsed in tears. "Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to your own family channel, Mr. Peter Family. May the Almighty surround every woman with a shield of unbreakable courage, rivers of calm and grace that never runs dry. May every wound find healing, every fear find rest, and every hidden prayer rise to the heavens with power. May your silence be filled with strength, your steps guided by wisdom, and your days lit with miracles no one can block. You are the breath of compassion, the pillar of every home, the gentle fire that keeps love alive in the darkest nights. May peace sit softly on your shoulders, may blessings chase you down, and may joy return to you in ways that leave you speechless. My precious family, don't stay silent tonight. Your voice fuels this home. A like is a whisper of faith. A comment is a spark of unity. If you carry love in your heart, like this video. If your spirit walks in faith, comment, "I'm with Mr. Peter." The photographs landed on Jacob Breeden's mahogany desk like grenades, each image detonating another piece of his carefully constructed reality, while his mother stood watching with the expression of a surgeon who had just removed a tumor. His hands trembled as he stared at the woman he loved entering a hotel with a man whose face he recognized from business circles, timestamps burning into his retinas like acid, bank statements showing deposits that aligned with every intimate moment they had shared. Constance Breeden stood across from her son with the posture of a general delivering necessary casualties, her manicured fingers drumming against her Hermes bag, while Jacob's world collapsed in real time around them both. "I hired the best investigators money could buy," his mother said, her voice carrying that particular blend of satisfaction and concern that had shaped every major decision of Jacob's entire existence. "This Lara Paul has been playing you from the very beginning, darling. Women like her see men like us as lottery tickets, nothing more than a meal ticket to a lifestyle they could never achieve on their own merit." Jacob wanted to argue, wanted to defend the woman whose laughter had taught him what genuine joy actually felt like after years of manufactured corporate smiles. But the evidence scattered across his desk told a story his heart could not reconcile with the memories of her touch against his skin. 3 months of surveillance, dozens of encounters captured in devastating clarity, financial transactions that painted Lara as exactly what his mother had always warned him about during those endless lectures about appropriate partners. The black velvet box in his drawer suddenly felt like a monument to his own stupidity. The ring he had chosen during 3 sleepless nights now transformed into a symbol of how thoroughly he had been deceived by someone he had believed understood him in ways no one else ever had. "She was meeting with Richard Blackwell," Constance continued, her tone sharpening like a blade finding flesh and cutting deeper with each word, "your biggest competitor in the Richardson acquisition. The deposits came from one of his shell companies, transferred within hours of your private dinners where you discussed strategy. Do you understand what this means, Jacob? She was selling your secrets, pillow talk turned into corporate espionage, and you were too blinded by infatuation to see what was happening right under your nose." The words crashed over Jacob like freezing water, drowning the voice in his head that screamed this could not be true, that Lara's eyes, when she looked at him, held nothing but genuine emotion, that the connection between them transcended anything as crude as money or manipulation. But his mother had never been wrong about business matters, had built the Breeden empire alongside his father, through ruthless assessment of threats and opportunities, and the evidence before him was undeniable, methodical, devastating in its completeness. Every photograph was time-stamped and location verified, every bank statement traced through multiple accounts, every piece of the puzzle fitting together to create a picture of betrayal so complete it left no room for doubt. His office door opened, and Lara entered with that radiant smile that had once made him believe in something beyond quarterly reports and shareholder meetings, her presence lighting up the space in ways that expensive art and designer furniture never could. She wore a simple dress that somehow made her more beautiful than any designer gown could achieve, her natural elegance a stark contrast to the calculated sophistication of the women his mother paraded before him at charity galas and society functions. For one suspended moment, Jacob saw her, as he always had, luminous and real and entirely his, and then the photographs on his desk reasserted their brutal truth, and everything shifted. "Jacob, I've been thinking about what you said last night about the future," Lara began, her voice warm with anticipation that made what was about to happen even more cruel. "I know we haven't talked about it directly, but I want you to know that I'm ready for whatever comes next, that I trust us completely." The words died in the air as she registered Constance's presence and the expression on Jacob's face, confusion flooding her features as she looked between mother and son, trying to understand the tension crackling like electricity between them. Something inside Jacob cracked under the pressure of betrayal and his mother's poisonous certainty, creating fissures in the foundation of everything he thought he knew about love and trust. The ring in his drawer, the future he had imagined where they built something real together, the vulnerability he had allowed himself to feel for the first time since his father's death, all of it transformed into weapons his wounded pride wielded without mercy or hesitation. "You're a mistake," Jacob heard himself say, his voice cold and foreign even to his own ears, the words coming from some primitive place where pain became cruelty and love transformed into its opposite. The words came from the son who had always sought his mother's approval above all else, who executed her judgment without question because questioning meant admitting she might be fallible. "Everything between us was a mistake from the very beginning, and I was a fool to believe someone from your world could ever love someone from mine for anything other than money and status." He watched Lara's face transform in slow motion, joy bleeding into confusion and then horror as he grabbed the photographs and thrust them toward her, like accusations given physical form. Her hands shook as she looked at the images, her mouth opening to speak, but Jacob could not stop the avalanche of venom his mother had planted in his soul, could not control the rage pouring out of him like poison that had been building for 3 months, while she had apparently been betraying him. "I have proof of every meeting, every deposit, every single moment you were playing me while selling information to Richard Blackwell," he continued, each word a nail in the coffin of what they had built together over 8 months, of what he had believed was genuine connection. "Did you laugh about it with him? Did you compare notes about how easy it was to manipulate the lonely billionaire who actually thought you cared about him as a person rather than a bank account?" "Jacob, this isn't what it looks like. Please just listen to me." Lara's voice broke on his name, her eyes desperately searching his face for the man she knew. But Constance moved closer to her son with subtle possessiveness, a physical reminder of where his true loyalty should reside and always had. "I want you out of my building, out of my life, and if you try to contact me again, I will make sure every door in this city closes in your face." Jacob delivered the final blow with precision learned from years of business negotiations, treating the woman he loved like a failed investment to be liquidated and removed from his portfolio. "My attorneys will send you a check for whatever you think you're owed, but after that, if I ever see you again, I'll destroy whatever pathetic career you've managed to build on the backs of men you manipulate." The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, the world holding its breath before devastation made itself heard in the ruins of what had been Lara, stood frozen with the photographs clutched in her trembling hands, and something shifted in her expression that Jacob would spend years trying to forget, trying to erase from his memory during sleepless nights when guilt came calling. The softness drained away from her features, replaced by a dignity so profound it made her untouchable, unreachable. A queen standing among ruins, she refused to let define her worth or her character. She did not cry, did not beg, did not rage against the accusations he had thrown at her, like weapons designed to wound. Instead, she carefully placed the photographs back on his desk with movements so controlled they bordered on supernatural, and when she met his eyes, Jacob felt the full weight of what he was destroying crash over him, even as his wounded pride and mother's influence kept him silent and unmoved. "You'll regret this for the rest of your life, Jacob Breeden," Lara said quietly, each word falling like stones into still water that would never be calm again. "Not because you're losing me, but because you never really knew me at all, and when you finally discover the truth about what actually happened here, You'll realize you destroyed the only real thing you ever had in your manufactured existence." She walked toward the door with her head high and her spine straight, every step an act of defiance against the humiliation he had tried to inflict upon her character. Just before she disappeared from his life forever, she turned back one final time, her eyes holding something that looked almost like pity mixed with the devastation. "I hope your mother's approval keeps you warm at night, because you just traded everything that mattered for her blessing, and that choice will haunt you until the day you die." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything, and Jacob stood in his office surrounded by photographs and lies, and his mother's satisfied smile, having just destroyed his own heart while calling it self-preservation. Chapter 2. The secret she carried 3 weeks after Jacob Breeden erased her from his life, like she was nothing more than a line item to be removed from his ledger. Lara Paul sat on a clinic bathroom floor with a positive pregnancy test trembling in her hands, like evidence of a love that had turned to ash overnight. Her best friend Keisha waited outside the stall, her presence a lifeline in an ocean of grief that threatened to pull Lara under with every breath she struggled to take. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with mechanical indifference, while Lara's entire future restructured itself around the reality of 3 pink lines on white plastic that would change everything about the life she had been trying to rebuild from ruins. Her body had been trying to tell her the truth for days, morning nausea that arrived with cruel punctuality every time she tried to eat breakfast, exhaustion so profound she could barely drag herself through freelance design projects that used to energize her, a sensitivity to smells that made her gag in grocery store aisles she had walked through countless times before. She had attributed it all to heartbreak, to the way she could not eat without remembering dinners where Jacob had made her laugh until her sides ached, could not sleep without seeing his face twisted with disgust as he called her a mistake and accused her of betraying him for money. But biology did not care about emotional devastation or broken hearts, and now she held proof that Jacob Breeden had left her with something far more permanent than memories that cut like glass every time they surfaced. "Lara, honey, talk to me." Keisha's voice filtered through the bathroom door, concern wrapped in the gentle insistence of someone who had known her since college, who had witnessed the entire relationship from that first kiss at the charity gala to the final destruction in his office. "Whatever that test says, we'll figure it out together. You're not alone in this, I promise you that." Lara emerged from the stall on shaking legs and saw her own devastation reflected in Keisha's expression as her friend registered the truth without words being necessary between them. They moved to the doctor's examination room in a daze, Lara's mind cataloguing impossible decisions while her hands instinctively moved to her still flat stomach where something miraculous and terrifying was happening. The ultrasound screen flickered to life minutes later and revealed not one heartbeat but 3 tiny pulsing lights that rewrote Lara's understanding of what her life would become and what sacrifices she would need to make. "Triplets," the doctor said with clinical gentleness, pointing to each flickering point on the screen that represented a life depending on decisions Lara would make in the coming hours. 3 healthy heartbeats, measuring about 8 weeks along. This is going to be a high-risk pregnancy that will require careful monitoring and significant lifestyle adjustments. Have you considered how you'll proceed with the pregnancy and what support systems you have in place? The question hung in the air while Lara stared at the evidence of 3 lives growing inside her body, 3 souls that Jacob had helped create during nights when she had believed his whispered promises about forever and building something real together. Her mind raced through scenarios that all ended in impossible choices that would define the rest of her life. She could tell him, could present him with this information and watch him accuse her of manipulation, of trying to trap him with a pregnancy he would never believe was real rather than calculated. She could imagine his mother's face, the cold calculation as Constance Breeden offered her money to disappear, to terminate the pregnancy, or to raise these children alone while signing away any claim to the Breeden legacy and fortune. "I'm keeping them," Lara heard herself say, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face and the terror gripping her chest. All three of them, no matter what it takes. Keisha gripped her hand with fierce support, but asked the question that weighed on both their minds like a stone they could not move. Are you going to tell Jacob? Doesn't he deserve to know he's going to be a father, regardless of what happened between you? Don't these babies deserve to know their father? The word deserve detonated something primal in Lara's chest, rage mixing with protective instinct to create a resolve forged in betrayal's fire that would never be extinguished. She thought about how Jacob had looked at her with such contempt and absolute certainty in her guilt, how he had believed fabricated evidence without giving her a single chance to defend herself or explain, how he had threatened to destroy her career and reputation if she dared contact him again. The man who had thrown her out of his life so completely, so cruelly, did not deserve to know about the miracles growing inside her body that she would protect with everything she had. A man who called me a mistake and accused me of selling him out for money doesn't deserve to raise my sons, Lara said, and the possessive pronoun felt right, felt true, felt like the only protection she could offer these vulnerable lives that had not asked to be created in the middle of such devastation. He'll think I'm trying to extort him or trap him into marriage, or worse, he'll fight for custody not because he loves them, but because Breeden men don't abandon their heirs, and he won't want the scandal. I won't give him the opportunity to reject these babies the way he rejected me, to make them feel unwanted before they're even born. She moved to Portland 3 weeks later after her cousin offered refuge in a cramped apartment that smelled like coffee and possibility, leaving behind the city where every street corner held memories of the man who had destroyed her trust in love itself. Her graphic design business could function remotely with clients never needing to know that she worked with one hand on her keyboard and the other on her expanding belly, that she took breaks to cry in the bathroom when grief ambushed her without warning during the middle of designing logos for companies that represented other people's dreams. The pregnancy was brutal in ways the medical books barely touched, her body attempting to nourish 3 rapidly growing humans while she survived on crackers and stubbornness, and the determination not to let Jacob's cruelty define her entire future. Keisha visited when she could manage the trip from California, bringing supplies and asking questions Lara could not fully answer even to herself. Would she tell the boys about their father someday? What would she say when they asked why he was not there for birthdays and holidays? How would she explain that their existence was rooted in a love that had curdled into accusations and abandonment? I'll tell them the truth when they're old enough to understand complexity, Lara decided during her second trimester, watching her belly move with the evidence of 3 distinct personalities already asserting themselves through kicks and hiccups. That their father loved me once, but circumstances beyond my control tore us apart in ways that couldn't be repaired, and I made the choice to raise them alone rather than subject them to his rejection or his mother's racism that would poison their entire childhood. She built a fortress around her heart, brick by deliberate brick, each prenatal appointment another stone in the wall that would keep Jacob Breeden from ever hurting her again or getting close enough to wound her sons. Some nights she woke reaching for her phone, muscle memory betraying her with the urge to call him, to share the miracle of feeling 3 babies move simultaneously inside her body, to hear his voice even if it came wrapped in cruelty and accusations. But then she would remember his face when he called her a mistake, the disgust in his eyes as he looked at her, and she would hold her belly and whisper promises into the darkness that felt sacred and unbreakable. You are wanted, she told her unborn sons every single night before sleep. You are loved beyond measure, and you will grow up knowing your worth has nothing to do with your father's fortune or his family's name or their poisonous values. I will be enough for you. And if he ever finds us, he will have to prove himself worthy of knowing you exist, worthy of breathing the same air as the incredible humans you're going to become. When Zane, Cade, and Ryder entered the world during a storm that rattled the hospital windows and knocked out power in 3 districts, Lara held all 3 of her sons against her chest and felt something fierce crystallize in her soul that would define every decision she made for the rest of her life. These boys had her eyes and Jacob's bone structure, her determination and his intelligence, and they were hers in ways that transcended biology or circumstance or the pain that had brought them into existence. "Your father doesn't know you exist, and that's his loss," she whispered to 3 sleeping faces that would grow up without ever hearing Jacob Breeden's name spoken in their home. "But you will never, for one single moment, doubt that you are the best thing that ever happened to me." Chapter 3. The Ghost He Could Not Find. Jacob's descent into doubt began with small fractures that widened into chasms large enough to swallow his entire sense of reality. Starting the morning, he reached for his phone to call his mother's investigator with follow-up questions and discovered the number had been disconnected without any forwarding information. His fingers hovered over the screen in his penthouse office, while confusion morphed into suspicion. The kind of instinct that had made him successful in business now turning inward to examine the foundation. His cruelty toward Lara had been built upon Constance had been evasive when he asked for direct contact information with the investigator, changing the subject with practiced deflection that he had not questioned at the time, and Jacob felt the first tremor of something that would eventually destroy him completely and remake his understanding of his own mother. He hired his own investigator without telling Constance, a decision that felt like betrayal even as he justified it as due diligence, needing to understand why Lara's face haunted him in crowds and dreams with increasing intensity as weeks turned to months. The investigator he chose had a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsessive, someone who would find truth regardless of who it implicated or what comfortable lies it destroyed. The weeks waiting for the report were torture punctuated by his mother's obvious satisfaction as she introduced him to appropriate women from appropriate families at carefully orchestrated dinners and gallery openings, women who knew which designer wore which season, but who made him feel absolutely nothing except a growing sense that something fundamental was wrong. Every business deal felt hollow, despite the profits they generated, every success meaningless when he returned to an empty penthouse that echoed with Lara's absence, and he began drinking bourbon at his office window while staring at the city below, and wondering why destroying Lara had felt so much like amputating part of his own soul. His assistant noticed the change in him, the way he stared at nothing during meetings, the distraction that made him ask people to repeat themselves. But she said nothing because Jacob Breeden's personal struggles were not her concern as long as the company continued its upward trajectory. The investigator's report arrived on a morning that started ordinary and ended with Jacob's entire world revealed as a construction built on lies and bigotry and his own weakness. He sat at his desk reading the document 3 times, while his hands shook and his vision blurred, each word another brick removed from the foundation of his relationship with his mother until the entire structure collapsed and revealed the rotting truth beneath. The hotel encounters had been staged using actors his mother had hired through intermediaries that required extensive investigation to trace, the timestamps altered with software that left no digital fingerprints for casual examination. The man in the photographs, someone who had never met Lara Paul in his life, but had been paid handsomely for his performance. The bank deposits came from a shell corporation Constance controlled through her personal attorney, money moved specifically to create the appearance of payment for information that had never been sold because Lara had never betrayed him in any way. Every piece of evidence that had convinced Jacob to destroy the woman he loved had been manufactured with meticulous care by the woman who had given him life, raised him, shaped every value he had ever held as truth. The investigator had even tracked down the actors, obtained signed statements admitting they had been hired to stage encounters specifically designed to be photographed, had been coached on timing and locations that would align with Jacob's schedule with Lara. Jacob read the report 3 times while experiencing something that felt like his personality fracturing, each word forcing him to confront the reality that Constance Breeden had not been protecting her son from a gold digger, but protecting the family legacy from contamination by a black woman without pedigree or wealth. Her racism had been dressed up as maternal concern, her manipulation so complete that Jacob had become the weapon she wielded to destroy his own happiness, and the realization made him physically ill in the private bathroom attached to his office. He confronted her that same afternoon in the sitting room where she took tea surrounded by antiques and photographs of Breeden ancestors who all shared the same pale complexion and self-satisfied expressions that suddenly looked sinister rather than proud. Constance did not flinch when he threw the investigator's report on her tea table, scattering pages across the surface like accusations she could not avoid. She did not deny the accusations or attempt to justify her actions with anything resembling remorse, simply set down her cup with delicate precision and met her son's fury with ice in her eyes that spoke to values he had never fully understood until this moment. I did what any mother would do to protect her son from making a catastrophic mistake that would have destroyed generations of careful positioning, she said, her voice carrying the absolute conviction of someone who believed their prejudice was simply good sense and practical wisdom. That woman was not one of us, Jacob. She would have produced mixed children who could never truly belong in our world, who would have diluted generations of careful breeding and social positioning we've maintained. Since your great-grandfather built this empire, I saved you from embarrassment, and I saved this family from permanent damage that could never be undone. The casual racism in her tone, the clinical language about breeding like they were discussing livestock rather than human beings, the complete absence of remorse or understanding of what she had destroyed, all of it crashed over Jacob like a wave of sewage that made him want to scrub his skin until it bled. He realized with sickening clarity that he had absorbed these values without examination, had allowed his mother's poison to flow through his veins, until he could look at Lara with contempt and call her a mistake, until he could believe the worst about someone who had never shown him anything but genuine love. You destroyed the only real thing in my life because you're a bigot, Jacob said, each word carrying the weight of a relationship ending in real time between mother and son. You manufactured evidence, hired actors, moved money around through shell companies, all to make me believe the woman I loved was betraying me. And your only regret is that I discovered the truth instead of living with your lies forever. Constance's expression never changed, her composure absolute, even as her son looked at her with hatred that would never fade or transform into anything resembling forgiveness. You'll thank me eventually, she said with infuriating certainty. When you marry someone appropriate and have children who can actually inherit this empire without complications or questions about their background, you'll understand that I acted out of love for you and for everything this family represents. Jacob walked out of his mother's house, knowing he would never return, would never forgive, would never again make the mistake of valuing her approval over his own judgment or basic human decency. He cut her from his business operations completely over the following weeks, removed her from every board and advisory position she held, made it clear to their entire social circle that Constance Breeden was no longer welcome in his life or his company. But none of it brought Lara back or undid the cruelty he had inflicted in his mother's name while believing he was protecting himself. He hired 5 different investigators to find Lara, offering rewards that increased weekly as desperation grew, searching employment records and social media profiles, and anything that might lead him back to the woman whose forgiveness he did not deserve but desperately needed to ask for. Weeks became months, and Lara Paul had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, leaving no digital footprint, no forwarding address, no trace of her presence in the world they had briefly shared. Jacob became a man possessed by absence, seeing Lara in every dark-haired woman on the street, hearing her laugh in his dreams, carrying the weight of his mistake like stones in his chest that grew heavier with each passing day until he could barely breathe. His empire expanded while his soul contracted, success measured in dollars that meant nothing without someone to share them with who actually knew him beneath the money and status. Jacob understood he had become exactly what his mother had always wanted him to be: wealthy, powerful, appropriate, and absolutely miserable in ways that no amount of success could remedy. The ring he had chosen for Lara remained in his desk drawer, a monument to his cowardice that he could not bring himself to discard, and some nights he would hold it while bourbon blurred the edges of his guilt and imagine alternate timelines where he had trusted love over his mother's lies. But Lara remained gone, vanished into a life he could not access no matter how much money he threw at the problem, and Jacob Breeden learned that some mistakes cannot be undone with apologies or explanations, that calling someone a mistake leaves scars that no amount of regret can heal. Chapter 4. The Family She Built from Ashes. Lara's modest apartment in Portland became a universe unto itself, filled with the beautiful chaos and overwhelming joy of raising 3 boys who shared her determination and their unknown father's sharp intelligence, their laughter erasing the silence that had threatened to consume her after Jacob's betrayal turned her world to ash. Zane was her philosopher from the moment he could form coherent sentences, always asking why the sky changed colors and how birds knew where to fly during migration, his mind working through problems with methodical precision that reminded Lara of late-night conversations she had tried desperately to forget Cade was her warrior, positioning himself between his brothers and any perceived threat, even as a toddler barely steady on his feet. His fierce protectiveness, a shield against a world that sometimes looked at their single-parent family with judgment. Ryder was her artist, finding beauty in raindrops on windows and shadows cast by streetlights, his sensitivity so acute that he cried when story characters suffered hardship and drew pictures of families that always included an empty space he could not explain. Her graphic design business grew through word of mouth and relentless late nights working after the boys fell asleep in the bedroom they all shared, building a client base that valued her eye for color and composition without knowing she created their brands while surviving on 4 hours of sleep and determination forged in abandonment's fire. Money was always tight in ways that required constant creativity, shopping at thrift stores and cooking in bulk portions that would last for days. Teaching her sons that wealth measured itself in love and presence rather than possessions, that their small apartment held more genuine value than any penthouse because it was filled with people who chose each other every single day without obligation or expectation. Keisha visited from California whenever her demanding work schedule allowed, bringing presence and boundless energy and asking the question that made Lara's chest tighten every single time without fail. Didn't the boys deserve to know who their father was? Didn't Jacob deserve a chance to make things right now that enough time had passed for wounds to scar over? Didn't everyone involved deserve the truth regardless of how painful it might be? Lara would watch her sons building elaborate block towers and staging games with complex rules they invented themselves, their faces so clearly echoing the man who had called her a mistake, and her resolve would harden into something unbreakable that no argument could penetrate. "My sons deserve a father who believes in their mother without requiring proof," Lara would say, her voice carrying the weight of a decision made in blood and tears that she would defend until her last breath. Jacob Breeden had his chance to trust me when it mattered most, and he chose his mother's manufactured lies instead. So until he proves he's worthy of them through sustained action rather than empty words, they're better off thinking their father is gone than knowing he's a man who abandoned them before they even existed. The boys asked about their father sometimes with increasing frequency as they grew older, especially when they saw other families with dads who pushed swings at the park and played catch in yards, fathers who showed up at school events and soccer games. She had prepared a carefully constructed story, a version of the truth that protected them from the full weight of rejection they were too young to process. Their father had loved her once, but circumstances beyond her control had torn them apart in ways that could not be mended. And someday, when they were older and could understand complexity, she would explain everything without filters or protection. She took them to museums on free admission days and libraries where they could check out unlimited books, taught them to stand up for themselves and others who could not defend themselves, raised them to value character over wealth and integrity over status and appearance. Watching them grow into remarkable little humans filled her with pride so fierce it sometimes brought tears during quiet moments, proof that she had been right to protect them from a man who might reject them the way he had rejected her, right to build this life without the person who had destroyed her trust in love itself. They learned to read curled up beside her on their second-hand couch that she had found on the street and refinished herself during pregnancy, practiced writing their names at the kitchen table she had rescued from a donation center, and every milestone was evidence that they did not need Jacob Breeden's fortune to become extraordinary human beings. Zane was reading at a second-grade level by age 5. Cade could do addition and subtraction in his head that amazed his kindergarten teacher, and Ryder's artwork covered their apartment walls like a gallery celebrating childhood imagination. Some nights after the boys were asleep in their shared bedroom, Lara would look through old photographs on her phone that she should have deleted but could not quite bring herself to erase, despite knowing they caused pain. Pictures of Jacob laughing at something she had said, sleeping peacefully beside her in the bed they had shared, looking at her with tenderness that had felt eternal until it evaporated overnight like morning dew under harsh sunlight. She wondered if he ever thought about her during sleepless nights, if he had discovered his mother's deception and felt any remorse, if he lay awake regretting the cruelty he had inflicted without giving her a chance to defend herself. But then she would delete the thoughts the same way she should have deleted the photos, because Jacob Breeden had made his choice and she had made hers. Her life was full of grocery store runs where she taught them about budgeting and homework help at the kitchen table, scraped knees that needed kissing, and soccer practices where she cheered louder than any other parent. Bedtime stories read in 3 different voices because each boy demanded equal attention and unique recognition. This life she had built from the ashes of her shattered heart was imperfect and exhausting and financially precarious and absolutely beautiful in ways that wealth could never purchase or replicate. She was enough for her sons, they were enough for her, and if Jacob Breeden never found them, it would be his loss rather than theirs, because these boys were the best parts of both their parents, even if only one was brave enough to claim that truth. The boys' 5th birthday arrived with a party in their small apartment, Keisha and Lara's cousin and a handful of friends from school crowding into the space that had become their sanctuary from a world that could be harsh and judgmental. Lara watched Zane, Cade and Ryder blow out candles while their faces glowed with happiness that had nothing to do with expensive presents or elaborate entertainment, and she felt something settle in her chest, like a foundation finally solidifying. These boys knew they were loved unconditionally, knew they were wanted with every fiber of her being, knew their worth had nothing to do with the man who had contributed DNA, but never earned the sacred title of father through presence and sacrifice. But that night, after everyone left and the boys were asleep surrounded by their modest new toys, Lara stood at her kitchen window, looking at the city lights, and allowed herself one moment of brutal honesty that she rarely permitted. Part of her, a small treacherous part she could barely admit existed even to herself, still wondered what would happen if Jacob ever discovered the truth about his sons, if he would fight for these boys with the same intensity he brought to business deals, or if he would reject them the way he had rejected her. And the fear of that rejection was what kept her walls so high, and her secrets so carefully guarded that not even Keisha knew the full depth of her terror. Chapter 5. The collision that changed everything. Jacob saw Lara Paul on an afternoon that started with routine business meetings and ended with the complete destruction of everything he thought he understood about loss and consequences and the price of his own cruelty. Walking through Portland's waterfront park during a business trip that brought him to a city where he never imagined his ghost would become flesh and blood reality. He was supposed to be focused on development proposals and investment projections for a project that would expand his empire into the Pacific Northwest, his business associates discussing profit margins and zoning regulations while they walked toward the restaurant where lunch reservations waited. But then he heard a laugh that stopped his heart mid-beat and turned his head toward a sound that had haunted him for 5 years. Without mercy, Lara stood near the playground, looking more beautiful than memory had preserved through years of guilt and searching. Her hair longer and pulled back in a way that highlighted features he had memorized but somehow forgotten. Her face holding a confidence that had not existed when he knew her, but that suited her in ways that made his chest ache with loss. But what made Jacob forget how to breathe, what made his vision narrow and his legs weaken? Was the scene unfolding before him like a vision designed specifically to torture him for sins he could never atone for sufficiently? Three boys who looked about 5 years old were racing around her in circles with the boundless energy of children who felt completely safe in their mother's presence, identical in their basic bone structure, but distinct in their movements and expressions, in ways that spoke to different personalities already fully formed. Even from 30 feet away, Jacob could see himself reflected in their faces with such devastating clarity that denial became impossible, no matter how much his mind scrambled for alternate explanations. One boy had his exact profile visible when he turned to call something to his mother. Another moved with the same unconscious grace Jacob saw in mirrors and old photographs. The third had his eyes in a face that was otherwise purely Lara's. And together they created a picture so devastating that Jacob felt his knees actually weaken beneath his weight. His mind scrambled to make sense of what he was seeing, while his associates continued talking beside him about matters that no longer held any importance whatsoever. He calculated ages and timelines with the precision that had made him successful in business, remembering that Lara had walked out of his office exactly 5 years ago, understanding with brutal clarity that she must have been pregnant when he called her a mistake and destroyed them both with words that could never be taken back. The realization hit him like a physical blow that drove the air from his lungs and made the world tilt sideways on its axis. His business associates were still discussing construction timelines, but their voices became meaningless noise as Jacob watched Lara catch one of the boys who had stumbled over his own feet, watched her kiss his forehead and smooth his hair with such practiced tenderness it carved wounds in Jacob's chest that would never fully heal. He watched her laugh at something another boy said, while the third climbed on the playground equipment with fearless confidence, and the scene was so perfect and so devastating that he could not look away despite the pain it caused with every passing second. She looked happy in a way he had never been able to make her happy during their time together, complete in a way that had nothing to do with him or his wealth, and the realization that she had been raising his sons without him for 5 full years hit like a freight train carrying the weight of everything he had lost. He started walking toward her without conscious decision, his body moving while his mind remained frozen in shock and desperate need to understand what this meant. His associates called after him with concern and confusion, but he could not stop, could not think about anything except reaching the woman who had vanished and the children who were clearly, undeniably his, in ways that transcended any possibility of coincidence. Lara saw him when he was still 20 feet away, and every ounce of color drained from her face, like blood leaving a body, her entire body going rigid with something that looked like pure terror that made his heart break all over again, and she immediately gathered her sons closer to her with protective instinct that spoke to maternal fear he had caused. One of the boys asked a question Jacob could not hear from his distance, pointing at him with the innocent curiosity of a child who did not understand the complexity of adult relationships and betrayals. Lara's response was immediate and decisive. She started backing away while herding her children toward the parking lot, with clear intention to flee before he could reach them. Panic seized Jacob's chest because she was leaving, taking his sons away before he could process what he was seeing or understand what this meant, and desperation made him call out louder than he intended. "Lara, wait, please!" His voice cracked on her name, raw with 5 years of grief compressed into 2 syllables that carried all his regret. "Lara, I just need to talk to you for 1 moment. Please don't run." She stopped walking but did not turn around, her shoulders rigid with tension that vibrated through her entire frame, and when she finally faced him after what felt like an eternity, her expression held such fury and protectiveness that Jacob felt like he was looking at a stranger wearing Lara's face. Gone was the soft woman who had loved him with abandon and trust, replaced by a mother bear prepared to destroy anyone who threatened her cubs, regardless of past connections or biological claims. "Stay away from us," she said, her voice low and dangerous in ways he had never heard before, one hand on each of 2 boys, while the third pressed against her side seeking protection. "You made your choice 5 years ago when you called me a mistake and threw me out like garbage, Jacob, and we made ours. You don't get to rewrite history now that it's convenient." He looked at the boys, who stared back at him with variations of his own eyes, studying him with the intense curiosity children reserve for interesting strangers. And he saw his features mixed with Lara's in faces that represented lives he had missed completely. His vision blurred with tears. He had not cried since his father's funeral, his chest constricting with grief, so overwhelming he thought he might actually collapse right there in the park in front of the family he had unknowingly abandoned. "Are they mine?" he asked, though he already knew the answer with absolute certainty, could see it in every detail of their faces, in the way they stood and moved and looked at the world around them. Lara's laugh was bitter and broken, a sound that held 5 years of raising 3 children alone, 5 years of sleepless nights and financial struggles and fears she had faced without the man who had helped create these lives before destroying everything with his weakness and cruelty. "They're mine," she corrected him with steel in her voice that could cut through bone and muscle. "They've always been mine. Every diaper and fever and nightmare, every milestone and triumph and scraped knee, every moment of their lives has been mine alone. You don't get to show up after 5 years and claim what you threw away before it even existed." One of the boys tugged on her sleeve and asked, "Mommy, who is that man?" in a voice that carried across the distance between them, and Jacob heard himself referred to as "that man" by his own son, who did not know his name or face, and the pain was so overwhelming he thought he might actually die from the weight of it crushing his chest. "No one important, baby," Lara said, and the words destroyed Jacob more completely than any rage or accusations could have accomplished. "Just someone who was leaving right now." She turned and walked away from him with decisive finality, the boys looking back over their shoulders with confusion and curiosity in their innocent faces, their small features imprinting themselves on Jacob's soul in ways that would never fade no matter how many years passed. He stood frozen in the middle of the park while his entire world restructured itself around the truth that he was a father to 3 sons, that Lara had been pregnant when he called her a mistake, that he had 3 children who did not know his name or that he existed, and the weight of this revelation crushed him so thoroughly that his associates had to guide him to a bench before he fell. Chapter 6. The reckoning he could not escape. Jacob became a man possessed by the overwhelming need to understand every single moment of the lives he had missed, hiring investigators not to find Lara this time, but to learn everything about the family she had built in his absence while he had been living in ignorance. And the information arrived in detailed reports that read like accusations against his very soul. His sons were named Zane, Cade, and Ryder, names he had no part in choosing, names that carried meaning he would never fully understand because he had not been there when Lara made those decisions alone in a hospital room. They attended a school 3 blocks from Lara's modest apartment that the investigators described as clean but cramped, nothing like the luxury Jacob could have provided if he had known they existed, if he had not destroyed everything with his inability to trust the woman he claimed to love. The reports detailed everything with clinical precision that made each fact more painful. The boys played soccer on weekends in a league Lara could barely afford, wore uniforms she had purchased second-hand and washed meticulously, celebrated victories with pizza from the cheapest restaurant because that was what her budget allowed. They had a grandmother figure in Lara's cousin who helped with childcare when their mother worked late finishing design projects that barely covered their expenses, living on financial margins that made Jacob want to scream because he had billions sitting in accounts while his sons wore thrift store clothes. The boys had never once asked about their father because Lara had told them he was gone in a way that did not invite questions or create false hope. A carefully constructed story that protected them from rejection they were too young to understand. The investigator had even obtained copies of school records that showed all 3 boys were thriving academically despite their circumstances, that teachers described them as polite and curious and kind, that they had friends and interests and full lives Jacob knew nothing about because he had not earned the right to know. Jacob spent days watching from a distance like a criminal, studying his victims from shadows, seeing his sons laugh and play and live entire lives he had no part in creating or supporting. He saw Zane help a younger kid on the playground one afternoon, patiently explaining how the monkey bars worked with the same methodical kindness Jacob vaguely remembered from his own childhood, before money and status had complicated everything. He saw Cade defend Ryder from a bully twice his size during recess, stepping between them with fearless protectiveness that made Jacob's chest ache with pride he had absolutely no right to feel. He saw Ryder draw pictures during quiet time at school, his small face scrunched in concentration as he created art that his teacher praised with genuine enthusiasm that made the boy beam with pride. Each observation was another knife twisting in Jacob's chest, because these were remarkable children he had no right to know, boys who carried his DNA but not his name, who shared his features but not his life or his fortune. His business empire suffered as he cancelled important meetings and ignored urgent calls from board members, unable to focus on anything except the family he had abandoned before they even existed. His assistant finally confronted him about his deteriorating performance, worried expressions replacing her usual professional detachment, asking if something was wrong, if there was anything she could do to help him through whatever crisis was obviously consuming him. "I destroyed everything that mattered," Jacob told her, and it was the truest thing he had said in 5 years of living a lie. He knew he needed to talk to Lara again, needed to explain in detail about his mother's deception and the fabricated evidence, needed to beg on his knees for a chance to know his sons and be part of their lives in whatever limited capacity she would allow. But every time he tried to approach her apartment or catch her at school pickup, he would remember the terror in her eyes in the park, the way she had gathered the boys like she was protecting them from a monster who might snatch them away, and he understood that his presence in their lives right now represented a threat rather than an opportunity. So instead he sent flowers with a note that said only, "Please let me explain everything." But they came back unopened with a message scrawled across the card in Lara's distinctive handwriting. "Explanations change nothing about what you are." He sent carefully composed letters that were returned, marked refused without being opened, left voicemails on a number he finally tracked down that went unreturned no matter how many times he called, tried every method of communication he could imagine and received only silence in response that spoke louder than any words could have. His frustration grew alongside his desperation, until one afternoon he simply showed up at her apartment door unannounced, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might crack his ribs and expose his chest cavity. And when Lara opened the door, her face transformed from surprise to fury so fast it gave him whiplash. She stepped into the hallway immediately and closed the door behind her with decisive force, physically putting herself between him and her sons like a human shield that would not be breached under any circumstances. "How dare you show up at my home?" she hissed, keeping her voice low so the boys would not hear but unable to contain the rage burning in her eyes. "How dare you track us down like we're your property and invade our privacy after what you said to me, after how you treated me like garbage, after threatening to destroy my career if I ever contacted you again?" Jacob raised his hands in surrender, in supplication, in desperate plea that came 5 years too late to matter. "My mother fabricated everything," he said, the words rushing out in a flood he could not control or organize coherently. "The photographs, the bank statements, the hotel encounters with your supposed lover, all of it was fake, manufactured using actors and altered timestamps, designed specifically to break us up because she's a bigot who couldn't stomach the idea of me marrying a black woman and having mixed-race children. I was an idiot for believing her lies, an absolute fool for not trusting you, for saying those terrible, unforgivable things, and I've spent 5 years trying to find you so I could apologize and explain and beg your forgiveness for destroying us." Lara's expression did not soften even slightly. If anything, she looked even more enraged, her eyes blazing with fury that had been building for half a decade without release. "So you discovered the truth, and now you want forgiveness?" she asked, her voice dripping with contempt that scalded like acid on exposed skin. "You want me to welcome you back with open arms because it turns out I wasn't actually a gold digger selling your secrets? Do you have any idea how insulting that is, Jacob? You didn't trust me enough to ask basic questions, didn't love me enough to fight for us against your mother's manipulation, just accepted lies about my character because she manipulated you, and you were too weak to stand up to her racism." Each word landed like a physical blow, and Jacob absorbed them all, because he deserved every accusation and worse. "You're absolutely right," he said quietly, his voice breaking under the weight of his own guilt. "I was weak and blind, and I failed you in every possible way, but Lara, those boys in there are my sons, and I'm begging you for a chance to be their father, to be part of their lives in whatever limited way you'll allow." She laughed then, harsh and humorless, her eyes filling with tears she furiously refused to let fall, because crying would mean showing vulnerability she could not afford in front of the man who had shattered her. "You lost that right when you called me a mistake," she said, her voice shaking with emotion she could barely contain. "You lost that right when you threw me out of your office and threatened to ruin me professionally, when you spent 5 years living your perfect billionaire life, while I raised 3 babies completely alone on a budget that would embarrass you. You don't get it back just because you finally figured out the truth about your mother's racism." The door opened behind her and Zane appeared, looking at Jacob with curious, analytical eyes that were exact copies of his own, studying the stranger with the intensity of a child who notices everything and forgets nothing. Jacob felt his heart stop completely, because this was his son, his child, his own blood, looking at him like a complete stranger who meant nothing. "Mum, who's this?" Zane asked with the directness of a child who had not yet learned social filtering. Lara immediately softened as she turned to shepherd Zane back inside with gentle hands that had probably soothed thousands of tears and nightmares and fears Jacob would never know about. "No one important, baby," she said, and the words destroyed Jacob more completely than any rage could have. "Just someone who was leaving right now and won't be bothering us again." She looked at Jacob one last time, her face hard with protective fury that would not bend or break regardless of his explanations or apologies. "Stay away from my sons, Jacob Breeden, or I swear I will get a restraining order and you will never see them again. They don't need a father who only showed up because he felt guilty, and I don't need you disrupting the life we've built without you." She closed the door in his face, and Jacob stood in that hallway, understanding with brutal clarity that discovering the truth was not the end of his punishment. It was only the beginning. Chapter 7. The devastation of knowing Jacob's mental state deteriorated rapidly as the reality of his situation crushed him from all directions simultaneously. The knowledge that he had 3 sons who would grow up without him carving wounds in his psyche that nothing could heal no matter how much money he spent on therapists or solutions. He stopped eating properly, his body forgetting what hunger felt like, while his mind remained trapped in Portland with a family that would never be his, meals sitting untouched on expensive plates in his penthouse that might as well have been prison cells. Sleep became impossible beyond an hour or 2 at a time before nightmares woke him gasping, his dreams filled with visions of his sons growing up through milestones he would never witness, graduating from schools he would never attend, getting married in ceremonies where he was nothing but an absence, and he would wake soaked in sweat, with loss so profound it felt like drowning on dry land while air entered his lungs. His board of directors started asking pointed questions about his ability to continue leading the company effectively, performance reviews showing a decline that would have been unthinkable before Portland changed everything. Friends stopped calling after he cancelled plans repeatedly with increasingly vague excuses, unable to pretend interest in dinners and social events when his sons were living lives he could not access. The only person who kept trying to reach him with relentless determination was his mother, who he had not spoken to since discovering her betrayal, and her messages piled up unheard in voicemail boxes that approached maximum capacity, while Jacob's hatred for Constance Breeden grew into something that felt permanent and all-consuming. She showed up at his office building one afternoon, somehow bypassing security protocols he had specifically instructed to never let her enter under any circumstances, and confronted him in the lobby with tears he did not believe for 1 second, and apologies that meant absolutely nothing after what she had destroyed. "Jacob, please, I'm still your mother, regardless of my mistakes," she said with desperation that might have moved him years ago, reaching for him with manicured hands while he stepped back like she carried infectious disease. "What I did was wrong, but I did it out of love, out of fear that you would ruin everything our family has built over generations, and I'm begging you to find it in your heart to forgive me because I cannot live with your hatred. You destroyed the only woman I ever loved and cost me 5 years with my sons," Jacob said, his voice cold enough to freeze blood in veins and arteries. "There is no forgiveness for that crime, Mother. There is only the rest of your miserable life knowing you succeeded in making me as unhappy as you apparently needed me to be, knowing you turned me into a weapon that destroyed my own family before it could exist." He hired the best family attorneys money could buy with unlimited budgets and learned with crushing finality that he had virtually no legal rights to his sons because his name was not on their birth certificates, because Lara had never claimed child support or acknowledged his paternity in any legal capacity, because legally he was nobody to them regardless of biological reality. The lawyers explained with professional detachment that he could petition courts for paternity testing and custody rights, that DNA would prove he was their father beyond any doubt, but they warned him in the strongest possible terms that forcing Lara into court after abandoning her would likely destroy any remaining chance of building a relationship with his children. Judges tended to favor mothers who had raised children alone for years, when fathers appeared suddenly demanding access they had never earned through presence or support, especially when those fathers were billionaires who could have provided for their children, but had not, because they did not know those children existed due to their own cruelty. The legal reality was that Jacob had all the money and power in the world, but absolutely no leverage in this situation because courts cared about children's best interests rather than fathers' regrets or guilt. So Jacob was trapped in a hell entirely of his own creation, watching from a distance as his sons lived their lives without him, sending money anonymously through attorneys to a bank account Lara never touched because she wanted nothing from him except his continued absence. He tried to find ways to be part of their world without actually being allowed in it, desperate measures that made him feel increasingly pathetic. He donated an enormous sum to their school anonymously, funded new playground equipment and a comprehensive art program, sponsored their entire soccer league with enough money to provide free uniforms and equipment to every child who wanted to play, all anonymous contributions that somehow made him feel even more worthless because money had always been his solution to problems that money could not actually fix or resolve. Keisha appeared at his hotel one afternoon unannounced, having tracked him down through means she refused to explain despite his questions, and she looked at him with a mixture of pity and anger that made Jacob feel like an insect being examined under glass by a scientist studying pathetic specimens. She had aged well over 5 years, still carried herself with the confidence he remembered from the few times they had met during his relationship with Lara, but her eyes held judgment that made him want to crawl out of his own skin and become someone else entirely. "What you did to her was unforgivable," Keisha said without any preamble or social niceties, sitting across from him in his hotel suite like she owned the space and he was the intruder. "But watching you destroy yourself slowly isn't giving Lara any peace or helping those boys in any way. And they deserve better than a mother who's terrified every single day that their wealthy father will try to take them away through courts and lawyers." Jacob explained about his mother's deception in detail, and Keisha's face showed she already knew everything, that Lara had told her the entire story about Constance's fabricated evidence and racist motivations the moment Jacob had shown up in Portland. "The fact that you were manipulated by your bigot mother doesn't erase what you chose to believe about Lara," Keisha said, her voice firm and uncompromising. "You looked at the woman who loved you with everything she had and decided she was capable of betrayal without giving her a single chance to defend herself, and that says something fundamental about you that discovering the truth doesn't fix or excuse." She left him with brutal advice that would haunt him for months afterward. If he wanted any chance with his sons, he needed to prove himself to Lara first, through sustained action over time. Needed to show that he was capable of being the man those boys deserved, rather than just the man who shared their DNA through a biological accident. Jacob thought about this constantly during sleepless nights, about what proof would actually look like in practical terms, about how to demonstrate worthiness to a woman who had every reason to hate him and no reason to trust anything he said or promised. His birthday came and went without any celebration or acknowledgement, just him alone in a hotel room looking at photographs his investigator had taken of his son's 6th birthday party. 3 boys blowing out candles while their mother watched with love that Jacob had thrown away like garbage. He composed letters to his sons that he never sent, hundreds of them over months that turned into a year, explaining why he was not there, what he had done wrong, how much he loved them, despite never having earned the right to claim that love or express it in their presence. So Jacob made a decision that felt like death, but was perhaps the only path to anything resembling redemption. He would stop forcing himself into their world through investigators and surveillance, stop trying to shortcut his way to forgiveness through grand gestures, and instead he would build himself into the kind of man who actually deserved these sons. Chapter 8. The Fury That Would Not Be Tamed. Lara's rage was a living thing that burned hotter with each passing day, a fire that consumed her thoughts every time she remembered Jacob's reappearance in their carefully constructed lives. This man who had destroyed her so completely and now wanted to play father to sons he had never earned the right to claim through presence or sacrifice. She increased security protocols at the boys' school immediately after the park encounter, having lengthy, detailed conversations with administrators about who was allowed on official pickup lists, providing multiple photographs of Jacob with strict written instructions that he was never under any circumstances to have contact with her children. She changed their soccer league to one across town, even though it meant significantly longer drives and tighter schedules that made her life more complicated, all because she could not shake the terror that gripped her chest every time she thought about Jacob using his money and lawyers to take them from her. Keisha kept pushing her to at least talk to him properly in a neutral setting, to let him explain in exhaustive detail what his mother had done and how he had been manipulated, arguing that the boys deserved to know their father, regardless of past mistakes that could never be undone. Lara wanted to scream at her best friend because none of it mattered in any meaningful way. None of it changed the fundamental truth of what Jacob had revealed about himself in that office 5 years ago when he looked at her with contempt and called her a mistake without giving her a chance to speak. "He chose not to trust me when it mattered most," Lara told Keisha during a phone call that lasted hours and went in circles without resolution. "When I needed him to believe in me and my character, he looked at fake evidence manufactured by his racist mother and decided I was exactly what she accused me of being. And that tells me everything I need to know about the man he really is, underneath all that money and charm and business success." Keisha argued that people make terrible mistakes when manipulated by family members they trust, that he had been systematically deceived by someone he had no reason to doubt. But Lara refused to accept excuses for betrayal that had shaped 5 years of her life and her son's entire existence. "I was manipulated too," she countered, her voice rising with frustration at having to explain this repeatedly. "I was shown false evidence and lied to and hurt beyond measure, but I never once doubted Jacob's character when we were together, never once believed he could be cruel or calculating, and when he told me to leave, I walked away with dignity, instead of forcing him to prove accusations he had no right to make without evidence." The boys started asking more questions about the man in the park, with increasing frequency that made Lara's anxiety spike. The stranger their mother had been so visibly upset by creating mystery they could not stop wondering about. Zane was especially persistent, his analytical mind worrying at the mystery like a puzzle demanding solution, asking questions she deflected but could not make disappear. "Did that man know Dad?" he asked one night during their bedtime routine, and Lara's heart stopped completely because she had never actually told them their father was dead, just gone in a way that had not invited this specific question. "That man is not part of our family," she said firmly, tucking the blanket around Zayn's small body while trying to keep her voice steady and authoritative. "And I need you to trust me when I say he cannot be allowed into our lives. Sometimes protecting people you love means keeping them away from situations and people that could hurt them deeply." Cade accepted this immediately, with his protective instincts rising to defend their family unit, nodding seriously and promising to keep his brothers safe from any threat. But Zayn frowned with the expression he wore when something did not make logical sense to his precise mind, and Ryder looked sad in a way that made Lara feel like she was somehow failing them, despite doing everything possible to protect them. She received a letter from Jacob's attorney about establishing paternity and custody arrangements, legal language that made her blood run cold because it meant he was willing to force this through courts, to use his unlimited money and power to take what he had no right to claim. She hired her own attorney immediately that same day, a fierce woman who specialized in protecting mothers' rights against wealthy fathers, who appeared years late and prepared for war because Jacob Breeden would have to destroy her completely and utterly before she let him anywhere near her sons. Her attorney explained with professional honesty that Jacob actually had a surprisingly strong case for paternity and visitation rights despite his complete absence from their lives, that courts generally believed fathers should be involved in children's lives regardless of past circumstances or mothers' justified anger. Lara felt the ground shifting under her feet, because suddenly the choice was not entirely hers anymore. The control she had maintained for 5 years slipping through her fingers like water she could not hold. The idea of losing even partial custody, of being forced by courts to hand her sons over to a man they did not know every other weekend, filled her with such terror she could barely breathe through panic attacks that struck without warning. She called Jacob from a blocked number late one night, her voice shaking with fury when he answered on the first ring like he had been waiting by his phone. "You would do this," she demanded without preamble or greeting. "You would traumatize these boys by dragging us to court, forcing them to endure custody evaluations and paternity tests, making them choose between parents when they don't even know you exist?" Jacob's voice on the other end was completely wrecked, barely recognizable as the confident businessman she had once known and loved. "I withdrew the petition," he said, each word sounding like it cost him everything he had. "I filed it out of desperation and fear of losing them forever, but I withdrew it this morning because you're absolutely right, because forcing this through courts would hurt them, and I won't be another person who causes them pain after everything they've already lost because of my mistakes." Lara did not know whether to believe him, did not know if this was legal strategy or genuine remorse that would last. "Then what do you want?" she asked, her free hand gripping the kitchen counter so hard her knuckles went white with pressure. "I want to earn the right to know them," Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying weight she could hear even through her protective anger. "I want to prove to you over however long it takes that I've changed fundamentally, that I understand what I destroyed, that I can be trusted with the most precious things in your life. I'm not asking for rights or custody or anything the courts could give me. I'm asking for a chance to become worthy of being their father." Lara laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and ugly in her small kitchen. "There is nothing you can do to prove that to my satisfaction," she told him with absolute conviction born from 5 years of single parenting. "Nothing you can say or buy or achieve that will make me believe you're capable of being the father they deserve. Because the first test of your character happened 5 years ago, and you failed so spectacularly, there's no redemption possible." She hung up before he could respond with more promises or explanations, her hands shaking so badly she had to sit down on the floor and focus on breathing. And that night, after the boys were finally asleep, she allowed herself to cry for the first time since the park encounter. She cried for the woman she had been, who believed in love, conquering obstacles, for the man Jacob could have been if he had been stronger and trusted her, for her sons who deserved a father, but instead had a vacancy that no amount of her love could completely fill, no matter how hard she tried, But even through her tears, even acknowledging the painful complexity of the situation they were trapped in, Lara could not bring herself to forgive him or imagine a scenario where she would ever trust Jacob Breeden with her children's vulnerable hearts. Chapter 9. The breaking point, where nothing is resolved. Jacob existed in painful limbo for months that stretched into a full year of purgatory, maintaining his physical distance while his heart remained permanently anchored in Portland, living half a life while his sons grew and changed in ways he learned about only through investigator reports that felt increasingly like violations of privacy he had no right to commit. He attended therapy 3 times a week at Keisha's forceful insistence, working through his mother's systematic manipulation and his own fundamental weakness with a psychologist who specialized in family trauma and complex guilt. The sessions were brutally difficult, excavating wounds he had spent his whole life covering with layers of money and status and his mother's approval, forcing him to confront how he had built his entire identity and self-worth on external validation rather than internal values or genuine human connection. His therapist pushed him relentlessly to understand that his inability to trust Lara had stemmed from deeper fears about his own worthiness that had nothing to do with her actions, that calling her a mistake had really been about calling himself a failure who did not deserve genuine love, that he had needed to believe she was using him because the alternative meant accepting that someone could love him for who he was, rather than what he represented financially. The work was agonizing and necessary, slowly rebuilding a sense of self that was not dependent on his mother's approval or his company's success or any external measure of value. He cut all remaining business ties with Constance systematically over several months, removing her from every board position and advisory committee she held, making it crystal clear to their entire social circle that her presence in his life was finished forever, without possibility of reconciliation. When she showed up at his office one final time, he told her with cold clarity that she had destroyed his family and he would never forgive her for that unforgivable crime, and watching her face crumple brought him no satisfaction whatsoever, just bone-deep exhaustion. His empire continued to grow and expand into new markets, but he found himself making fundamentally different choices about how to use that wealth and power, prioritizing ethical development over maximum profit margins, creating extensive programs that helped single mothers find affordable housing and reliable childcare, funding initiatives that supported struggling families rather than just enriching shareholders who already had more money than they could spend, as if somehow becoming a better man in public could balance his catastrophic failure in private, as if philanthropy focused on families could atone for abandoning his own children before they were born. The boys turned 6 years old, and Jacob received photographs from the investigator he should have fired, but could not quite bring himself to dismiss images of a birthday party where they looked so much older and more real than the 5-year-olds he had seen in the park that grief cracked his chest open every time he looked at them. He composed letters to his sons that he never sent, despite writing hundreds of them over months, explaining why he was not there for their birthdays and soccer games, what he had done wrong to their mother, how much he loved them, despite never having earned the right to claim that love or express it to their faces. Keisha arranged a meeting with Lara at a neutral coffee shop, ambushing them both without warning or permission, and the conversation was stilted and painful, with Lara's fury still fresh despite 13 months passing since the park encounter. "You think a year of therapy erases 5 years of abandonment?" she asked him, her coffee untouched while her hands gripped the cup like a lifeline, keeping her grounded. "You think working on yourself through expensive therapy entitles you to access to my children like you've paid your dues?" Jacob had learned in therapy not to make excuses or justify his actions, to sit with discomfort without trying to escape it, to accept that some consequences last forever, regardless of personal growth. "No," he said simply, meeting her eyes even though it hurt to see her anger directed at him. "I don't think I'm entitled to anything after what I did. I think I destroyed the most important relationship of my life through cowardice and cruelty, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to become worthy of a second chance I may never receive and probably don't deserve." Lara's eyes filled with tears. She furiously refused to let fall in front of him. They ask about you sometimes, she admitted, and Jacob felt his heart stop completely in his chest. Not you specifically, because they don't know who you are, but about their father, about why he's not here for them, about whether he ever thinks about them or wonders what they're doing. Ryder especially. He's so sensitive to absence. He feels things the others don't notice. She looked at him with such devastating pain and confusion. I don't know how to answer them anymore, Jacob. I don't know how to protect them from the truth without lying to their faces, and I don't know how to tell them the truth without making them feel rejected before they even meet you and discover what kind of man you actually are. The coffee shop conversation solved nothing, resolved nothing, left them both raw and bleeding in ways that made moving forward feel impossible, while staying frozen felt equally unbearable. When Lara left, she did not explicitly forbid him from contacting her again, but she did not invite it either, leaving Jacob suspended in the same painful limbo he had been existing in for over a year. Winter turned to spring, and the boys were halfway through first grade, learning to read chapter books independently and write short creative stories, bringing home artwork and spelling tests that Jacob would never see hanging on refrigerators. His birthday arrived, and he spent it alone in his Portland hotel room that had become a second home, staring at the city lights and wondering if he would spend the rest of his life this way, existing on the periphery of the family he had created and destroyed, forever outside looking in at lives he could observe but never touch. Then, on an ordinary afternoon that seemed no different from any other, his phone rang with an unknown Portland number. And when he answered with his standard professional greeting, he heard a child's voice, small and uncertain, asking, "Is this Jacob Breeden?" And Jacob's entire world stopped rotating on its axis. The boy explained in a nervous rush that he had found a letter, one of Jacob's early attempts to explain and apologize, that Lara must have hidden but not destroyed completely, and he had kept it secret for weeks because he knew his mum would be upset. But he needed to know if the man who wrote it was really his father. Jacob's hands shook so badly he almost dropped the phone, nearly severing this connection to his son. "Yes," he whispered, his voice breaking completely. "Yes, I'm your father. Which one are you, sweetheart?" "Ryder," the boy said, and Jacob felt tears streaming down his face because this was his sensitive artist son, the one Lara said felt the absence most acutely. "Why did you leave us? Why didn't you want to be our dad?" The questions were so heartbreakingly simple and so devastating that Jacob struggled to form coherent words through the emotion choking his throat. "I didn't know you existed," he tried to explain, knowing how inadequate it sounded to a child seeking answers. "Your mother and I had a terrible misunderstanding before you were born, and by the time I learned about you boys, she was so hurt by what I had done that she didn't trust me to be your father, and she was right not to trust me." Ryder was quiet for a long moment, processing information that would change his entire understanding of his family and his place in the world. "Are you going to try to take us away from Mom?" he asked, genuine fear clear in his young voice, and Jacob felt his heart shatter into pieces he would never fully reassemble. "Never," he said fiercely, needing Ryder to believe this above everything else he said. "I would never do anything to hurt you or your brothers or your mother, who is the bravest, strongest person I have ever known. She raised you alone because I wasn't good enough to be there, and if I ever get the chance to know you, it will only be because she decides I've finally earned that privilege." He could hear voices in the background, Lara calling for Ryder with rising panic in her tone, and the boy whispered quickly, "I have to go. She doesn't know I called, but I wanted to hear your voice. I wanted to know if you were real or just a story." "I'm real," Jacob managed to say through tears, "and I think about you every single day." The line went dead, and Jacob sat in his hotel room and wept for the first time since the park, great heaving sobs that felt like they would tear him apart from the inside, because his son had reached out to him, had wanted to know him, and Jacob was still on the outside looking in with no resolution in sight. Chapter 10. The Final Reckoning and the Hardest Truth. Lara discovered Ryder's secret phone call within hours, because her son could not keep secrets from her, no matter how hard he tried, his guilt written all over his sensitive face, like accusations he was making against himself for breaking rules he knew were important. She found him in the room he shared with his brothers, staring at the letter he had hidden under his mattress. Jacob's handwriting explaining things a 6-year-old could not fully comprehend, but desperately wanted to understand. When their eyes met across the small bedroom, Ryder burst into tears that broke something fundamental in Lara's carefully constructed defenses. Tears that spoke to needs she could not meet no matter how much she loved him. She pulled him close while he sobbed against her chest, his small body shaking with the weight of secrets he had been carrying alone for weeks. "I'm sorry, Mommy," Ryder said through his tears, his words muffled against her shirt. "I just needed to know if he was real. If he actually wanted us like you said, because sometimes I dream about having a dad like other kids, and then I wake up and he's not there and it hurts so much I can't breathe right." Lara felt her heart crack open because she had tried so desperately hard to be enough, to fill every role her sons needed, but she could not be a father no matter how fiercely she loved them or how many sacrifices she made. She held Ryder while he cried out pain she could not fix, and made a decision that terrified her more than anything she had ever faced in her life. Her sons deserved the truth, all of it, delivered with honesty that would hurt, but was ultimately kinder than continued mystery that damaged them in ways she could not see. She gathered all 3 boys on the couch that evening, their faces serious as they registered their mother's unusual gravity. She told them everything without filters or protection, about falling deeply in love with a man named Jacob Breeden, about his wealthy family's lies and manipulation designed to break them apart, about how he had said terrible, cruel things and sent her away before learning she was pregnant with them. She explained about carrying them inside her body while building a new life alone in a strange city, about choosing not to tell Jacob because she was terrified he would reject them or try to take them away using money and lawyers. She described the park encounter, his claims that he had discovered the truth and wanted to be their father, and her overwhelming fear that he would hurt them the way he had hurt her. The boys absorbed this information with varying reactions that reflected their distinct personalities and ways of processing difficult truths. Zane wanted to know exactly what the lies had been and why Jacob had believed them without asking questions, his analytical mind dissecting the story for logical inconsistencies and trying to understand adult failures through a child's logic. Cade was immediately furious on his mother's behalf, declaring Jacob a coward who did not deserve them after abandoning their mum. His protective instincts rising to defend the family they already had, Ryder cried quietly while asking the question that destroyed Lara. "Does he actually want to know us, or does he just feel guilty about what happened?" "I don't know," Lara admitted with brutal honesty, her voice breaking as she pulled all 3 boys close against her body. "I don't know if he's capable of being the father you deserve, and I'm terrified of letting him into your lives, only to have him disappoint you, or decide you're too much trouble, or choose his money and status over being present for you the way you need and deserve." That night, after the boys were finally asleep, Lara called Jacob from her own number for the first time since his office, and when he answered, she could hear the fear and desperate hope warring in his voice. "Ryder told me about the call," she said without preamble, her tone clipped and businesslike to maintain control. "And I told all 3 boys the complete truth about us, about what happened between us, about why you're not in their lives." She heard Jacob's sharp intake of breath, could imagine his expression as he processed what this development meant for everyone involved. "I need you to understand something critical," she continued, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "If you come into their lives now, you don't get to be a part-time father who shows up when it's convenient and disappears when parenting gets difficult. You don't get to prioritize your business empire or your comfort over their emotional needs. You don't get to be Jacob Breeden, the billionaire. You have to be dad, and that's a much harder job with infinitely higher stakes." She laid out terms that felt impossible but were absolutely necessary for protection. Weekly therapy sessions together to rebuild trust between them, supervised visits that she would control completely, absolutely no legal action or threats around custody that would traumatize the boys, complete transparency about his family situation, including his mother's ongoing absence, and most critically important, the understanding that the boys' emotional well-being came before his desire for a relationship with them. If at any point I feel you're harming them emotionally, if you make them feel rejected or less than or like an obligation you're fulfilling, I will end all contact immediately, and you will accept that without fighting me in courts, she said, each word deliberate and final. And you need to understand that even if you do everything perfectly right, even if you show up flawlessly for years, they may never call you dad, may never give you the relationship you want, and you will have to accept that reality too. Jacob agreed to every single term without hesitation, his voice raw with emotion that sounded genuine, but Lara had learned not to trust emotion alone without action backing it up. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving I deserve to be in their world, and if that means supervised visits forever, if that means they only ever see me as that guy who's trying, then that's what I accept gratefully. I have no rights here, Lara. I have only what you're willing to give, and I'm grateful for anything." The first meeting was arranged for the following weekend at a public park with Keisha present as neutral mediator, territory where Lara could leave instantly if things went wrong. Jacob showed up an hour early, sitting on a bench while his hands shook and his heart threatened to explode from his chest with anxiety. When Lara arrived with the boys, they looked both curious and wary, three small humans who held his entire future in their hands without knowing the power they possessed. He did not try to hug them or call them son or claim any relationship he had not earned through years of presence. He simply introduced himself as Jacob, told them he was grateful they were willing to meet him, and asked if they had questions they wanted to ask without filters. What followed was the most important conversation of Jacob's life. Three 6-year-olds interrogating him about his absence, his intentions, his understanding of the pain he had caused their mother, who they loved fiercely. Zayn asked why he had believed lies about their mum without investigating first. His young face serious as he tried to understand adult failures. Cade wanted to know if Jacob would leave again when things got hard, if he was the kind of person who gave up on family when difficulties arose. Ryder asked the question that destroyed Jacob completely. "Do you actually want to be our dad, or do you just feel bad about what happened?" Jacob looked at the boy who had his mother's sensitivity and his own eyes, and answered with brutal honesty, "I want to be your father more than I've ever wanted anything in my entire life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But wanting something doesn't mean I deserve it, and I'm prepared to spend years earning that right, or to accept that I may never fully get it back because of what I did. What I did to your mother was unforgivable, and you boys deserve better than a father who wasn't there from the very beginning." By the end of the meeting, nothing was magically resolved. The boys were still guarded. Lara was still watching him with suspicion that would take years to erode, but there was a hairline crack in the wall between them, a possibility that had not existed before Jacob left that park, knowing the work ahead would be harder than anything he had ever done, that redemption would be measured in decades, not months, that his sons might always see him as the man who abandoned their mother rather than the father he was desperately trying to become. But as he drove away, he caught a glimpse in his rearview mirror of Zayn, turning to wave at him with a small hand, one tentative gesture that felt like grace he had no right to receive but would spend the rest of his life trying to honor. And for the first time in 6 years, Jacob Breeden had something precious and fragile: hope.